David, welcome to LSAT Unplugged.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining. So I'm really excited to connect with you because I know that you have a wealth of experience in the law school admissions process. Do you want to share just a little bit about what you do and how you got into it?
Sure. So we started the company InGenius Prep when I was in my 1L year at Harvard Law. My partner Joel was in his 1L year at Yale Law, which was a stressful time to be starting a company. But we started out kind of helping students informally that had known that we were admitted. The application was something that people knew how much work we put into it, and were seeking our advice for things like their personal statements, supplemental essays, and so our JD division was the first division of the company that started because of our founders' backgrounds. But we very soon after that started our MD division for sorts of other graduates, counseling, and now we have 10 offices worldwide.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic. And I understand that you have a lot of former admission officers on staff as well from law schools, right?
We do. We have about the numbers in flux, but we have about 182 former admissions officers, I think, from a variety of different programs, including former admissions officers on the JD and LLM side. Some schools combine those admissions offices. Some schools will separate them, but we have admissions officers from Harvard, Yale, Columbia, several other schools, including Gene Webb, who was the director of admissions at Yale Law School for 17 years.
Oh, wow, that's really something. So given your connections with all these admission officers, I know that you have a lot of advice to share, and I want to dive in and start giving applicants some of that advice. Just to start off, really simple, when should applicants start crafting their applications?
I think that applicants have to start thinking about building their candidacy from the time that they're in college, and if they're taking time off after college, at least 2 years in advance. That doesn't mean you need to be writing application materials then, but you need to be thinking of how you're crafting those materials. And I think some of the discussion we'll have later will tap into what you can actually be doing during that time. In terms of starting the actual application materials, usually the spring or summer before is when you want to start brainstorming different versions of your personal statement, and getting to work on some of your application work.
So what about personal statements specifically? When would you suggest brainstorming ideas versus going to final draft?
It's definitely an iterative process. So I know students who will start with little pieces of different ideas or anecdotes and try to blend them together. And that's a creative process that'll start from the spring or earlier for them. Most students really get going in earnest sometime in probably July or August, or some are even pushing it to September. You want to get your application in on a rolling basis as early as possible for the schools that are deciding on a rolling basis, but you obviously don't want to be submitting at a time where you're not presenting the most polished product that you can.
I'm glad you brought up the idea of the rolling process, because that is something I get a lot of questions about. Applicants know on average it's better to submit early, I imagine, but then what happens if, let's say, an applicant wants to retake the LSAT even in, let's say, November? What happens then?
So most schools aren't going to read your application until your file is complete. That being said, you have a complete application if you've submitted it with an LSAT score and are, if you're trying to retake, like you said, and submit that additional score, it's kind of in a gray area that depends on a particular school's policy. And that's where our former admissions officers help us out in telling us, okay, how exactly is this school going to be evaluating that? Because the answer that you might get publicly from a school about, a generic kind of rebuke, such as, oh, we're not going to look at everything, and, we'll look at it once or not look at it again. I don't think that's actually the case. So for students that have their application materials finished, you don't want to be submitting on a rolling basis and have them make that decision quickly and have it be a negative one. So if you're in the ballpark of the medians and you want to take again to get even higher, that's something to consider. Generally not something that I will advise students to do on a wholesale basis, but definitely not just kind of submitting, knowing you have that other LSAT score coming in your back pocket in a couple of months. You want to make sure that you're presenting once as a general rule, just like the law schools will tell you publicly.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, LSAT and GPA are the biggest factors, But what about applicants who just can't get those numbers up? What's the biggest advice you would give them in terms of strengthening their applications?
Well, I think that so there's obviously the LSAT and GPA are the biggest factors, like you said, but I think the two that are most easily manipulated, and I don't mean that in a kind of gamesmanship sense, but I mean what you can actually change are your LSAT and your application materials. And some of it you can change, you can change what your essay topic is, what the theme of that essay is, how you write about certain things about yourself. But you can't change, just like for the GPA, the thought process for those years prior, where you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what type of law am I interested in? Why am I interested in law? All the types of questions that you want to answer in a personal statement. So the students that are either splitter candidates and have high GPA, low LSAT, or low LSAT, or vice versa, those candidates really need to rely on external validation of their ability. So some kind of great story about why they want to be in intellectual property law or in music copyright or maritime law, whatever that specific area is. I like to think of law not as a monolith, just like I like to think of students going to business school as not, you don't go study business. That's not really a thing. There's finance, accounting, entrepreneurship. Same thing with law. Most people aren't eager to go study civil procedure and figure out, the mechanics of filing a lawsuit. So it's about what you use the law for as a tool, and same thing with corporate law, although I don't know if I'm correct there. A lot of students maybe do just want to go make money and study corporate law. So it's about what kind of other subject area. I like to think in an interdisciplinary sense, how can you combine this with the law so that you're doing interesting extracurriculars that can then manifest themselves in your application and in your story, rather than just, oh, I was a paralegal, or I spent this entire summer studying for the LSAT or clerking. Those are things you need to do, especially the LSAT. But you don't need to clerk. You don't need to be a paralegal. Those are things that could help you figure out if you do actually want to be in the legal profession. But people try to kind of check them off as boxes that aren't really boxes you need to be checking off, and could risk making you look more standard than other applicants.
Right. Now, speaking of external validation, what about letters of recommendation?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That's what I was going to talk about next. So if you think of LSAT and GPA, let's exclude the application for a second. If you're weak in one of those areas, you think of it like, I like to explain it to students like, okay, well, if you have a grade in school that's comprised of your final exams, your midterms, your homework, and participation, if you don't do well on your midterms, what do you have left? Well, the other three things. And so you can think of it a bit like a balancing equation, that if you don't do as well on your GPA, you want to make up for that by having a fantastic LSAT score and make sure you put extra work into that. If you're weak in both, frankly speaking, it's going to be difficult, but that doesn't mean that the game's over for you. You do want to find those external third ways, like the letter of recommendation fills a third-party knowledge gap. You as the applicant have told them interesting things and character attributes about yourself, and you've put yourself on reasonably level pegging with others in a standardized test, but maybe that recommender can give insight as to why your class was graded, without giving excuses, because you don't want to be giving these things, but how they know that the professors you took or the major you took at your school, they only give 1 or 2 A's or something like that. And it's notoriously difficult, and how you're a student who really went above and beyond to make sure you mastered the material. There are a lot of great things that someone could say about you. There are also, we talk about this a lot in the high school context, and it's less applicable for law school students, but there are still competitions and extracurricular activities like moot court, mock trial, things that you see a lot of. There are schools who specialize in this for students who want, like Houston, schools who train litigators, and those students will go there and compete at those schools. And if you are doing very well at that on a college level, that could be something that is attractive to a school for a law school. If you're nationally competitive, I see this a lot with high school debaters going to college as well. Obviously it's best if you have a great GPA and a great LSAT score, but if you're looking for an answer to that question, those are some of the things that you can try to control. Putting yourself in a position the last thing is that what the LSAT is supposed to do is equalize for a GPA. So it's putting you on level playing field with other applicants from other schools so that you're not comparing a GPA from Oklahoma and Yale. You have the LSAT to do that. So if you take that message and try to use that idea and say, okay, well, what opportunities can I have to go put myself in a place to compete with or be compared against other students of, that are going to be applicants to these schools and get some form of evaluation, then that's something that you can use as evidence, whether that's some kind of competition or mock trial or publication or letter of recommendation. Like one of the best students I know got into Yale Law School with a 167 LSAT, I think 4 or 5 years ago. And she had a great recommendation from a Yale law professor, because she was a research assistant for him.
That's really something. So I guess the biggest takeaway I'm getting from all of this is that providing them with some sort of objective measure, because the LSAT and GPA, they're numbers, they're objective. Obviously, there's grade inflation, work experience is hard to parse. But if you're getting this comparison on the part of the recommender saying this person is relatively better than others in some way, or they won a competition, they stand out in some way, that does, at least there was some sort of independent third party evaluating the candidate. Yeah,
and that's, other than the LSAT and GPA, obviously, which are the truest objective forms of assessment here, everything else in the admissions process is fairly subjective, and things change from school to school in minor ways. So one of the goals that we work on with students is not just having ideas, and you could have a student who's really passionate about certain areas of law or ideas and things they talk about and think about and really put in the work, but don't ever take that last 5 or 10% to get that as a concrete achievement or something on paper that's objective. So whether it's a quantifiable metric like a test score or a competition win or something like that where you've placed or ranked, even with the more subjective sounding things like activities that you do, trying to quantify in an activity list or a resume how you've actually participated in that and what you've done, such that you can be compared, like you said, for the letter of recommendation context. That's really important for students.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing, David. So just to leave off for one moment here, we've talked about getting into top law schools with top GPA, top LSAT, or other third party independent criteria. What if someone is not going to get into the top 14? They just don't have the numbers, don't have the resume. Are there any particular standout legal programs that students might want to look into?
I think the first thing to look at is, a lot of students, I know that in this industry, we look at, T14 on a lot of forums and blogs. People talk about T14. I don't really know why the 14 ever became the cutoff. That's a little strange to me. I think that there are plenty of schools that are wiggling in and out of that bottom of that range that are fairly good. So beyond that quibble, and beyond those fewer, I kind of think of it like Premier League soccer, where there's teams getting relegated at the bottom and coming back in and kind of on a rotating basis. But beyond that, I think that there are schools that specialize in certain areas of law. Most students that I talk to don't really have that specialty, though, and so aren't really ready, or I wouldn't advise them to pigeonhole themselves at that time. So the advice I would give is there are a lot of students who will say, all right, so I grew up in Florida, and I talk to a lot of people who say, well, I'd much rather, if I were working in Orlando, have a University of Florida law degree than I would have a Harvard law degree. And some people could think that's facetious, but alumni communities are extremely important. And when every top lawyer in the area comes from your school, that can really matter. I have a friend who went to LSU for law school, and he works in Baton Rouge, and that's where everyone went to law school there, and one or two other local regional schools. So this is something I see a little bit less pronounced, but still on the West Coast. If you're going to be in law school in UCLA or Berkeley or Stanford, Stanford's maybe a little different, and those are all very high-ranking schools, but there are plenty of examples of law schools in the area where if you're going to practice in San Francisco or LA or wherever the location is, it makes more sense for your career if you know you're going to be in that area, your family lives there, or there's a locus of a particular industry there, right? So if you're in Houston and you want to do oil and gas law or something, then that's something that can help you either with a regional specialty or a subject area specialty. But I advise students to stay away from the subject area specialty, just because generally an incoming 1L doesn't know anything about law school other than what they teach in first year of law school.
Right, but there's definitely something to the regional aspect that I think I definitely want students to keep in mind. There's a lot of truth to that.
A lot of people will just come to me and look at a median chart and say, I can't get into this or that school, and I, first of all, that's a lot of the times not true. But they also, you can look at different rankings regionally, and if you don't want to rely on rankings as just a kind of an introduction for you, you can talk to people who practice in that area. Look up the top firms, look at their bios on their webpage, see where they went to law school.
Right. Awesome, David. Thank you for sharing all this great advice for my audience today. What's the best way for applicants to get in touch with you if they're interested in potentially working with you and your team at InGenius?
You could email us at info@ingeniusprep.com. You could also visit our website, www.ingeniusprep.com, and sign up for a free consultation to talk to one of our admissions experts about how we might be able to help you, whether you're a couple years out and just thinking about it for kind of candidacy building services and advice, or actually in the application process now.
Awesome. Thanks again for taking the time, David. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. So I'd love to ask you some questions about the LSAT. There's a lot of changes with the LSAT. People asking a lot of questions, especially some of our international applicants, about the, wanting to use the GRE as a substitute, the digital format, the limitation on retakes. And I know this is your area of expertise. So can you tell us a little bit about how long you've been doing this and exactly what your organization does?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. So for those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I've been teaching the LSAT for about 15 years now, and there have been a lot of changes along the way. The biggest one, of course, being the new digital LSAT transition that just happened this year in 2019. Starting this fall, the LSAT went fully digital in North America. Students are getting administered the LSAT on a tablet, specifically a Microsoft Surface Go tablet. They get a booklet of scratch paper, but this does change how students need to prep. So I would suggest getting a tablet or borrowing one for at least a couple of practice run-throughs just to get a sense of what the format will be like for students. I won't do a whole walkthrough here because students can go elsewhere for that on my YouTube channel and podcast, or even go on LSAC's site at familiar.lsac.org to get a sense of what the exact features are like. If you can't get a tablet or don't have one, just treat your prep books like a screen. Don't write on them. Don't highlight on them. Do all your work on scratch paper to the side, which as a bonus lets you reuse your practice tests if you want to redo problems later. So for those outside North America, it still is a paper and pencil LSAT. Law schools are certainly aware of this change, but if you can't get the score you want, don't just blame it on the digital LSAT. Retake if you need to. And speaking of retake limits, David, yes, there are some new retake limits implemented this year. Specifically, you can now take the LSAT only 3 times in one admission cycle, which runs from June to May. You can only take it 5 times in a 5-year period and 7 times for life. You can apply for exceptions to the rule, but you better have a really good reason. I don't expect LSAC will want to make too many exceptions to this. And the reason they have this limit, by the way, is that due to the digital LSAT, they are reusing a lot of old, previously unreleased test forms. So someone who takes the LSAT overseas 3 years ago, that same test might be used in North America this year, or might be used as a future Sabbath observers test administration. And so there is some test reuse. LSAC is going to have to ramp up production of test forms, but that is one of the biggest changes. And so, as I would always say, don't take the LSAT until you feel reasonably confident you'll be ready, in part now, in addition, because of this new retake limit.
I imagine that I saw that there was a limitation on if you've received a 180, you can't retake it. So I don't imagine many of our students are having those issues, but that would be a great problem to have. I imagine that's more aimed at people in your position. So I hope you haven't taken the LSAT 12 times and gotten all those 180s and been the reason for this, for all those poor students who wanted to go out and take it and get a second 180.
Yeah. Going forward, you can't get too many 180s on record. That is in part because of folks like me who would mess up the quote unquote curve.
And there were, so 3 times in 1 year, a lot of students we speak to, or that's kind of the borderline of what they're thinking of. So are you finding that students are trying to think about how to strategically time their tests so that they're taking maybe a March iteration or a prior year iteration and getting it as close of a gap to take 4 as possible within the time frame they would actually take it?
Yeah, that would be the ideal, as you said. I think taking it early in the spring so you can retake in the summer and fall if you need to. So I would say, yes, if someone is planning to, let's say they want to apply in fall 2020, they could take the LSAT in January and March, then take it again in July and September. And that would be 4 takes surpassing the 3. I would never really recommend taking the LSAT more than 3 to 4 times max anyway, but that would be a way to skirt the 3 times limit because it's across 2 admission cycles.
So one of the questions that, I guess there's 2 ways to frame this question, but it's a question that I get a lot is, how do I start studying for the LSAT? And a lot of times the nuance to that is someone's maybe taken a course somewhere or picked up a book here and there and without much of a plan. And they're interested in kind of pressing a reset button for themselves. How do you advise a student to start? I know you have great plans and schedules and resources on your blog. If you could tell us a little bit about your philosophy there, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, sure. So I recommend, whether you're retaking or not, if you don't have a strong foundation, the process should look the same. Basically, it's theory, then practice. So you learn the basics, you learn the different question types, how to approach each, then you apply those strategies to specific LSAT problems. And I recommend a 5-step approach that I call the LASER approach to LSAT prep. LASER is an acronym standing for learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Learning is basically just the theory, learning the basics of what the exam involves itself. Second is accuracy, doing individual questions by type to learn how to approach each. S is for sections, 35-minute timed sections to help you work on your pacing. Fourth is E for endurance and exams, doing full-length 5-section exams, which is what you'll be doing on test day. And then R is for review, which is really often neglected. Students just want to do exam after exam and measure themselves, when in reality, the review process is where you really make the gains in understanding.
Do you recommend for the pacing and sections and also for the endurance that students do things like decrease their time artificially to try to fit it in, or add a section endurance-wise, maybe 6 sections instead of 5?
I like the idea of 6 sections occasionally. So let's say you could do maybe a quarter of your practice tests with 6 sections rather than 5. So do 3 sections back to back, then take a short break, then do 3 more back to back. But as for constraining the time below 35 minutes, I'm hesitant to recommend that because on test day, you will be doing 35 minutes and that could mess up your pacing a little bit. You don't want to speed through them too quickly. The exam is already so time constrained as it is.
Okay, that's good advice. How about for a retake? How would you prepare for a retake? Is there a different mindset, or is it still kind of applying that LASER idea?
It would largely be applying the LASER idea specifically on any identified weak areas. So if you have trouble with grouping games or weakened questions or flaw questions, you could focus more on those in terms of doing those individual sections or doing questions of that type in a row, just to really solidify your understanding there. But it largely does look the same, especially in terms of the review process. You'll just basically be spending more time on the review process than someone who still has more of the basics to learn. One thing I would add, though, is that if someone anticipates that they may need a retake, it's worth saving a handful of recent exams to use for a future potential retake. So maybe you want to do all the most recent even-numbered exams for your upcoming take, and then save all the odd-numbered ones out of the most recent 10 exams or so to do as full-length 5-section exams closer to your retake test date.
An interesting question that I obviously get a lot as well is the last week or the last 2 weeks before an LSAT, I see students really grinding away on full-length practice tests, and I don't know if that is the best idea for them or not. But I, certainly defer to your expertise. What do you advise in that last week if you've gone through the proper, preparation?
Well, the biggest risk I would see from someone who's doing lots of exams in the final week is burnout. Don't do full-length timed exams on consecutive days. Certainly don't do them every single day in that final week. You don't want to burn out. You want to walk into test day feeling fresh. So maximum, I would typically recommend 2 exams, maybe 3 a week, but probably closer to 1 or 2 because you want to allow enough time to review them in detail. And you also want to ask yourself, why are you doing these exams? Is it to get one more victory under your belt before you walk in? Is it to practice a certain pacing strategy? Whatever it is, have that reason in mind. Don't do it just because you think it's what you should do.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case for a lot of students. Just a test day, I've left myself some time, and all I know is to study the LSAT like I have been for the past period of time. I guess my last question is about timing. When do you think is for an average college student who maybe wants to, let's assume they're going straight through from college, when do you think they should take the LSAT?
I think they should probably take the LSAT if they want to go straight, probably in spring of junior year. So like we talked about doing it in potentially March and then again in the summer, then again in the fall if they want to. I'm not saying they should do it 3 times, but if you take it in March, then you have more chances to retake it in the future if you need to, and it won't delay your applications in the fall.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay. Well, where can we find some more of the helpful advice you've given? I know that you have some schedules out there. I remember from back when I was studying for the LSAT, you were around, and I definitely used a lot of your great materials. So can you tell us where to find where our viewers can find some of your information?
Yeah, sure. So they can find me, again, Steve Schwartz, on the LSAT blog. If you just Google me, I'll come up. You can also search the LSAT Unplugged podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and pretty much everywhere else, as well as the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel. It's where I'm putting out a lot of my information these days.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Steve. It was really great to talk to you and learn from your expertise.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.